They say the forest holds secrets, whispers carried by the wind, shadows that move when no one is looking. But what if, in the dead of night, you saw a figure standing just beyond the firelight? A man, smiling, watching, not moving, not speaking, just grinning in the darkness. Tonight, we bring you 4 terrifying stories of the smiling man. Real encounters that will make you question if you're ever truly alone in the woods. Are you safe, or is he already watching? Story 1. The silent visitor camping alone had always been Jake's escape from the noise of the world. The forest, with its towering pines and the whisper of the wind through the leaves, was his sanctuary. He never feared the darkness, never questioned the stillness. Until that night, the campsite was deep within the woods, miles from any sign of civilization. The only source of light was his small campfire, flickering against the surrounding trees. The night was quiet, too quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. Jake sat by the fire, sipping from a metal cup of coffee, staring into the flames. He had spent the day hiking, enjoying the solitude, but now, in the dead of night, something felt off. A pressure in the air, an unnatural stillness that made his skin prickle. Then he heard it, a crunch, soft, deliberate. Someone, or something, was out there. He slowly turned his head, scanning the darkness beyond the fire's glow. Nothing, just endless blackness between the trees. He shook his head, convincing himself it was just his imagination. Maybe a deer, maybe a fox. Another crunch. Closer this time. Jake's grip tightened on his cup. His breath slowed. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air. But beyond that, silence. He reached for his flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but bark and empty space. And then he saw it, a man standing just beyond the reach of the firelight, motionless, smiling. Jake's stomach dropped. The man was tall, unnaturally tall, with long, gangly limbs. His face was partially obscured by the dark, but the grin was unmistakable. Wide, too wide. Stretched beyond the limits of normal human expression. The man didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there. Jake swallowed hard. "Hello?" No answer. The fire popped and Jake flinched. When he looked back, the man was gone. A chill ran down his spine. He scanned the trees with his flashlight, his pulse hammering. No movement, no sound. Had he imagined it? No, that grin. It was burned into his mind. Trying to shake the unease, he stoked the fire higher, convincing himself that as long as it burned, he'd be safe. He kept the flashlight close, his hunting knife even closer. Sleep didn't come easy, but eventually, exhaustion took over. Then, deep in the night, a whisper, low, drawn out, almost playful. "Are you awake?" Jake's eyes snapped open. The voice was right outside his tent. He reached for his flashlight with trembling fingers, clicked it on, and pointed it at the fabric of the tent. A shadow loomed, tall, unmoving. Jake's breath hitched. His mind screamed at him to stay quiet, to pretend he wasn't there. But the moment stretched too long, the silence too thick. Then, the zipper of his tent started to move. Slowly, Jake lunged for his knife and slashed at the entrance. The blade tore through fabric, and he burst out of the tent, brandishing the knife. Nothing. The fire was dying, casting weak embers into the cold air. The forest was still, empty. His chest heaved, his hands shook. There were no footprints, no signs of anyone there at all. But he knew what he had heard. He knew what he had seen. Grabbing his gear, he doused the fire, packed as quickly as possible, and threw his backpack over his shoulder. He needed to get out, now. As he turned to leave, his flashlight flickered, and then, for the briefest moment, the beam landed on something just beyond the trees. The man, standing there, closer this time, smiling. Jake ran. the forest blurred around. Him, branches slashing at his arms, roots threatening to trip him. His lungs burned, his heart pounded. He didn't look back, he couldn't, but he could feel it, the presence keeping pace with him, watching. The parking lot wasn't far, just a little more, a little further. His foot caught on something. He crashed to the ground, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. Scrambling, he turned onto his back, flashlight swinging wildly, and there he was, the smiling man standing over him, grinning down. Jake screamed, kicked back, crawled away, but as his flashlight flickered, the figure melted into the shadows, vanishing, like he had never been there at all. Shaking, heart pounding, Jake scrambled to his feet and bolted the last stretch to his truck. He flung himself inside, locked the doors, and started the engine with trembling hands. The headlights cut through the darkness as he sped down the dirt road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. But as he reached the highway, his adrenaline finally fading, his eyes flicked to the mirror and his blood ran cold. In the back seat, a figure sat, not moving, not making a sound, just smiling. Before we continue, a warning. The stories you are about to hear are not for the faint of heart. They are whispers from the darkness, echoes of things best left forgotten. But if you crave the unknown, if you seek the truth hidden in the shadows, then join us. Like this video and subscribe to the channel. It may seem like a simple action, but in the realm of the unknown, every choice matters. And tonight, you might just wish you had stayed in the light. Story 2. The Trail Nowhere. The trail that leads nowhere. The first time Marcus heard about the unmarked trail, he thought it was just another campfire story. His cousin, Jared, had warned him about it the night before they set out for their camping trip in the mountains. "There's a path that wasn't meant to be found," Jared had whispered dramatically, grinning at their younger sister, Lacey, who shuddered in response. "Hikers stumble onto it sometimes, and the ones who follow it, well, they don't always come back." Marcus had rolled his eyes then, dismissing it as another attempt to scare Lacey. But deep down, something about the way Jared said it stuck with him. The woods were vast and unpredictable. What if there really was a trail that led somewhere it shouldn't? By the time they arrived at the campsite, he had nearly forgotten about it. That was before they found the trail. The path, that, shouldn't exist. The weekend was supposed to be simple, 2 nights of camping, hiking, and disconnecting from the world. Marcus, Jared, Lacey, and their friend Ben had all been looking forward to it. The first day went exactly as planned, setting up camp, cooking over the fire, and sharing stories beneath the stars. But everything changed on the second day. It was Lacey who found it. "Hey, look at this," she called out, her voice filled with curiosity. Marcus and the others turned to see what she was pointing at, a narrow dirt trail leading off from their main path. It was barely noticeable, hidden behind thick undergrowth, as though nature itself had tried to swallow it whole. Jared smirked. "Maybe it's the trail, the one that wasn't meant to be found." Ben scoffed. "Come on, it's just an old trail. Hunters probably used it." But Marcus wasn't so sure. The path looked too deliberate. The trees on either side leaned unnaturally inward, their branches forming a canopy that blocked most of the sunlight. The air felt thicker, the silence too complete. Lacey hesitated. "We shouldn't go down there," Jared of course grinned, "which means we absolutely should." Against better judgment, they stepped onto the trail, the silence that followed. At first, it was just a normal hike. The dirt path curved deeper into the forest, the trees towering higher and closing in tighter. The further they walked, the quieter. Everything became no birds, no rustling leaves, no wind, just their footsteps. "Okay, this is weird," Lacey muttered. "We should turn back." Marcus was about to agree when Ben froze. "Guys, do you see that?" They followed his gaze up ahead. A figure stood in the middle of the path, too tall, too thin, and smiling. The smiling. Man, for a long moment, none of them moved. The figure wasn't close, maybe 50 yards away, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. The way it stood, rigid, motionless, its head tilted ever so slightly to the side. The grin on its face was too wide, too fixed. "What the hell?" Jared whispered. Lacey grabbed Marcus's arm. "We need to go. Now!" Marcus took a step back, his gut screaming at him to run. But Jared, ever the reckless one, called out, "Hey, you okay, man?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move, and then, in a blink, it was closer. Half the distance between them was gone in an instant. Jared cursed. Ben stumbled backward. Lacey let out a sharp gasp. Marcus's heart pounded. "Go!" he shouted, grabbing Lacey's hand and turning back. They ran. But the trail was different now, a path with no end. The moment they turned, it was as if the forest had rearranged itself. The trail behind them should have been clear, but it wasn't. The trees were tighter, the path narrower, winding in ways it hadn't before. The silence was suffocating. The only sound was their own frantic breathing, then a whisper, not words, not a voice, just something shifting in the stillness. Marcus risked a glance over his shoulder. The smiling man was closer. It wasn't running. It wasn't even walking. But with each blink, each heartbeat, it was closer. Lacey sobbed. "It's not real. This isn't real." Jared grabbed her arm, pulling her forward. "Move!" Ben tripped. Marcus spun around to grab him, but Ben's face was twisted in horror, his eyes locked on something just beyond the trees. "He's everywhere," Ben choked out. "There's more than one." Marcus didn't look. He just ran. Escape. The path stretched, on endlessly, looping, twisting. Every time they thought they were nearing the end, they'd find themselves right back in the same spot. The whispers grew louder. Laughter, not human, but something close, echoed through the trees. Then, all. At once, the ground beneath Marcus shifted. He stumbled, crashing forward, and fell through darkness. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on the forest floor. Morning sunlight filtered through the trees. Jared, Lacey, and Ben were beside him, unconscious. The trail was gone. No sign of it ever having existed. The warning, they never spoke about it after that, not to each other, not to anyone, but sometimes, in the quiet of the night, Marcus still hears it, the sound of footsteps outside his window, and a soft, distant whisper, still, smiling. Story 3. The cabin, last guest. The plan had been simple, a weekend getaway far from the noise of the city. 4 friends, 1 isolated cabin, and nothing but the whispering trees and the cold mountain air to accompany them. Nathan had found the place online, a rustic abandoned hunting lodge deep in the woods. It had no electricity, no phone signal, and according to the listing, hadn't been used in years. That was the appeal. A real escape. The group arrived late on a Friday evening. Nathan, his girlfriend Sam, and their 2 friends Will and Rachel. The road had been rough, nothing but dirt and gravel, twisting through the thick, looming trees. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was gone, and the forest had swallowed them in darkness. The place looked even older than the photos suggested. The wooden planks groaned under their steps, and the wind howled through gaps in the walls. "Quaint," Will muttered, pushing open the door. Inside, dust blanketed every surface. Animal heads hung from the walls, their glassy eyes reflecting the dim glow of their lanterns. There was a stone fireplace in the center, a few wooden chairs, and a long dining table with carvings etched into its surface. Strange, looping symbols that looked neither decorative nor accidental. Rachel ran, a finger over them. Weird. Nathan dropped his bag and stretched. "Come on, this is awesome. A real old-school horror vibe." Sam frowned. "Yeah, let's just hope that's all it is." The first night, the night stretched long and uneasy. The wind outside carried a rhythmic whistling, like a melody repeated over and over again. At first, they assumed it was just the trees, But sometime after midnight, Rachel woke up to something else. A sound. She sat up in her sleeping bag, heart hammering. The others were asleep, their breath steady and slow. The fire had burned low, embers glowing beneath blackened logs. Then the sound again, a tapping. Soft, deliberate, knuckles against wood. Rachel turned toward the window. Just outside, past the warped glass, a figure stood in the dark. Not moving, not speaking, just watching. She couldn't make out a face, just a shape, too thin and too tall, its limbs oddly stretched, its head slightly tilted. Then, the smile. It spread slowly, unnaturally wide, like a crescent moon splitting its shadowed face. A grin that didn't belong to a human being. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. She wanted to wake the others, but fear held her frozen. The tapping continued. Then the figure took a step forward. Rachel squeezed her eyes shut, and when she opened them, nothing. The figure was gone, a stranger in the woods. She didn't sleep. After that, in the morning, she told the others, but they laughed it off. Probably just a shadow, Nathan said, stretching, or a weird dream. Rachel knew what she had seen. Will, always the skeptic, grinned. Let's check outside then. If some creep was watching us, there'll be footprints. They stepped out into the cold morning air, scanning the damp ground. No footprints. Not a single mark in the dirt, though the soil was soft enough to capture their own. Rachel's stomach twisted. I swear, It's fine, Sam said, placing a hand on her shoulder. If you're worried, we'll be extra careful. Stick together, don't wander too far, okay? Rachel nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching her. And maybe it still was. The forest laughs that evening as the sun dipped low. Will and Nathan set off to gather firewood. Sam stayed behind to prepare dinner, and Rachel, too unsettled to sit still, decided to explore the area around the cabin. She didn't go far. Just beyond the clearing, she spotted something strung up between two trees. At first, she thought it was a scarecrow, but as she stepped closer, dread coiled tight in her stomach. It was a mannequin, dressed in old, tattered clothes, its head covered by a burlap sack. The sack had been torn, revealing a mouth painted onto its surface. A grin. Rachel stumbled back, a chill rushing through her bones. Laughter, a whispering, breathy laugh coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. She spun around, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of anyone else. Just the mannequin, grinning in the fading light. The cabin's last guest. That night, the tapping returned. Harder, faster, more frantic. Then the door creaked open. Rachel sat up, heart hammering. The others stirred, woken by the noise. Nathan fumbled for the lantern, casting flickering light across the room. The door was open. The cold night air poured inside, making the fire shudder. "Hello?" Will called out, his voice hoarse. No answer. Nathan grabbed the hatchet from his pack. "Someone's messing with us." He stepped onto the porch. Rachel followed, her breath freezing in the air. Then she saw them. More figures, lurking between the trees, barely visible in the darkness. Grinning, not moving, not speaking, just smiling. Will cursed under his breath. "We're leaving, now!" No one argued. They grabbed their things in a frantic rush, tossing sleeping bags and supplies into their packs, shoving past each other in their desperation to escape. As they ran to the car, Rachel made the mistake of looking back. The figures were closer now, lining the edge of the trees, their mouths stretched impossibly wide. One of them raised a hand and waved. Rachel barely made it into the car before Nathan slammed the door and gunned the engine. They sped down the dirt road, tires skidding on the gravel. The cabin disappeared behind them, swallowed by the night. No one spoke. No one looked back. The final smile. They never found the listing again. Nathan swore he had bookmarked it, but the website was gone. The photos, the description erased, as if the cabin had never existed, but Rachel knew better. She saw them in her dreams now, smiling, waiting, and she knew one day they would come knocking again. Story 4. Now you see him. The forest was silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes every breath sound like a betrayal. The Appalachian Mountains stretched out like a dark sea of trees beneath the full moon, and as Jackson huddled by the dying embers of the campfire, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just him and two close friends, Alex and Mark. They had picked a remote clearing miles away from the nearest trail, hoping to escape the noise of the city. But now, Jackson wished for nothing more than streetlights and the comforting sound of traffic. Earlier that evening they had shared ghost stories, laughed over old memories, and even joked about the local legends, the ones about shadowy figures wandering these woods. But as night fully took hold, those jokes felt less amusing. At around midnight, Alex had gone to gather more firewood. That's when it started. A distant rustling, faint at first, then growing louder as if something or someone was circling the campsite. Jackson and Mark called out to Alex, but no answer came. Only the echo of their voices swallowed by the dense trees. Then the laughter started. It wasn't Alex. The laughter was sharp, unnatural, like the sound of a man forcing joy through gritted teeth. It echoed from all directions, bouncing between the trees like a cruel game. The fire cast long, dancing shadows, and Jackson noticed Mark scanning the perimeter, visibly unsettled. "Stay by the fire," Mark whispered, gripping his pocket knife tighter, but it was already too late. Between the trees, just beyond the reach of the firelight, Jackson saw him, a figure standing impossibly still. His posture was stiff, arms hanging unnaturally by his sides, but the most horrifying part was the smile. An exaggerated wide grin stretched ear to ear, too large for a human face, with eyes that glinted like wet glass under the moonlight. Jackson. He blinked. The figure was gone. He grabbed Mark's arm. "Did you see that?" Mark nodded slowly, fear draining the color from his face. "We need to find Alex." Against their better judgment, they left the campfire behind, stepping cautiously into the woods, calling Alex's name in hushed voices. The deeper they went, the colder it became, as if the forest itself was breathing around them. That's when they saw the footprints, bare footprints, leading further into the woods. No shoes, just the imprint of toes and heels in the damp soil. They followed them, heartbeats pounding in their ears. The laughter returned, closer this time, and so did the figure. Standing between two trees, he watched them, that smile never faltering. "Who are you?" Mark shouted, his voice trembling. The figure took a step forward, and the laughter rose into a frenzy. As Jackson stared, he realized the figure's feet weren't touching the ground. He was floating, just inches above it. "Run!" Mark hissed. They bolted, crashing through the underbrush, branches clawing at their faces. Jackson didn't dare look back, but he could feel it. The gaze, the suffocating presence right behind them, and that laughter, always the laughter. They stumbled into a small clearing, breathless. There, standing in the center, was Alex. But something was wrong. Alex was smiling. That same twisted, impossibly wide grin stretched across his face. His eyes were empty, pupils dilated and glassy. Jackson stepped forward, but Mark grabbed his shoulder. "Don't," he warned. Alex's head tilted, his grin widening further, if that was even possible. And then, from behind a tree, the smiling man emerged. His movements were jerky, like a marionette on tangled strings. He stood beside Alex, mirroring his grin. Jackson's stomach dropped. Without a word, the figure lifted a finger to his lips, signaling silence, and with a blink, the clearing was empty. Alex was gone. The smiling man was gone. Only the wind remained. Whispering through the trees, Jackson and Mark sprinted back to the campsite, desperate to reach the light. But when they returned, the fire was out. The tents were slashed open. and strange symbols were carved into the dirt around the campsite. As the clouds shifted, moonlight illuminated a final horror. Etched into a nearby tree, written in what looked like dried blood, were the words, "Now, you see him?" Jackson's blood turned to ice. Suddenly, from behind him, that familiar, horrifying laughter erupted. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Or so he thought. In the reflection of his own terrified eyes, he saw it. Standing, behind him, just inches away, the smiling man. The next time you find yourself alone in the woods, take a moment to listen, to watch. If you see a figure standing in the dark, smiling, do not approach, do not speak, just run. Because once the smiling man chooses you, he never lets go. If you made it to the end of this video, let us know in the comments. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you in the dark? Stay safe if you can.